Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 7. Chapter 54-61. Brianna's P.O.V. Against my better judgment, I had given Giovanni the address to my aunt's house. I knew what I should have done instead, beating myself down for being too weak. I should have rejected him on the spot. I should have grabbed Lola and Mason, leaving the club and my mate behind. My mom had spent my entire life telling me about the mate bond, and how it would be the happiest day of my life. I wonder what she would think if she knew the truth. This wasn't the happiest day of my life, it was the worst. A mate I could never be with, one destined to fight against my kind. It was selfish to hope he would abandon his kind when I would never do the same. I couldn't leave my pack and family behind, yet I couldn't say the 3 words that would sever our connection for good. I reject you. Those words physically couldn't form on my lips. The night Lola was marked by Tristan, I took her and Mason home. I stayed around long enough to learn the truth about Lola. She was half vampire. As bad as it sounded, my heart soared at the news. That meant a werewolf and a vampire were compatible in some form. If they could have children together, couldn't they somehow be mates? Maybe this wasn't such an anomaly. After taking Mason home, I hopped into my car. I knew I should have driven straight home, but my heart led me elsewhere. I was released from my thoughts as I pulled into the driveway of my aunt's house. The lights were off as they had been since she died. My aunt was much like Lola's grandma. They were both erratic with an incredible outlook on life. I turned my car off and stared up at the old farmhouse. There had been countless summers where I and my older sister would visit to play. My aunt had all kinds of animals back then. We would play with the horses, running from the hyperactive dogs that would circle our feet. When my aunt died, the animals were sold to various farms. The grass began to wither and no longer being taken care of. My mom could never bring herself to come back here. She had been close with her sister. Her th hit her harder than anything I had witnessed before. It was terrifying to see my mom down on her knees, tears streaming from her eyes as sobs of agony hit her. I opened the car door and stepped into the cool night. My body was on autopilot. I felt as though someone were tugging the mate bond, pulling me closer to where Giovanni may be. Things would have been so much simpler if I had just gone home. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door, hearing it creak loudly as it swung open. The house smelled of dust and my aunt's cinnamon apple air fresheners. They had long ago run out, but the smell remained. It was faded by time but was a peaceful reminder of who had lived here. I didn't lock the door behind me, some small part of me hoping Giovanni would show. I flipped on the lights, thankful my mom continued paying the electric bill. I think some part of her enjoyed pretending my aunt still lived here, that she was just a phone call away if anything happened. That made 2 people who were ignoring the truth, like mother like daughter. I sent my mom a quick text, letting her know I was sleeping over a friend's house. I made sure not to include any names, determined to keep Lola out of trouble if I could. I curled up in my aunt's teal armchair. Mom had hated this piece of furniture for years, yet my aunt never got rid of it. She claimed to love the wide seat, constantly stating how easy it was to curl up on with a book in hand. I think my aunt only kept it around to see the grimace on Mom's face. My aunt was funny that way. The armchair still smelled like her, light and floral. My eyes snapped open as the floorboards creaked warily. I had fallen asleep in my aunt's chair, lulled by the familiar sense of home. My heart nearly jumped from my chest, my eyes widening as I noticed Giovanni standing in the open kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, his dark eyes on me. I wondered how long he had been standing there for, and if he had watched me sleep. "You came," I choked out, my voice thick with sleep. I had to remind myself to stay on guard. Mate or not, Giovanni was the enemy. My wolf howled pitifully, pacing in my head. She had been trying to deny the thought, pretend this entire fight wasn't existing. It went against her nature to betray her pack, and yet it was also against her nature to reject her mate. We were both in a tight spot. My feet moved on their own, approaching Giovanni as he stood in the kitchen. His clothes had changed from what he was wearing at the club. He was dressed in a dark sweater, a thick leather jacket enclosing his torso. His curly hair was messy, drops of rain clinging to each strand. "I'm not sure why I came here," Giovanni murmured, his dark eyes were bright and wide as he looked down on me. "I felt as though you wanted me here." My mouth ran dry at the sound of his voice. His rough voice, with just a hint of an Italian accent. His voice sounded like honey, thick and sweet. It was something I could never tire of, and yet we could not be together. "It's the mate bond," I murmured, running my tongue along my dry lips. I could only imagine how it felt for Giovanni. Vampires weren't raised knowing about a future bond they would experience. "Mate bond," Giovanni repeated, his dark eyes glued to my lips. He was hanging on my every word, just as I was hanging on his. The mate bond cared not for species or wars. The mate bond had one duty, to bring two people together. It worked against Giovanni and I, turning our willpower to mush. The urge to step into his arms was overwhelming, his scent swirling around me in suffocating waves. My own willpower was the first to snap. My fingers twitched, wanting to feel his skin beneath my own. His tan skin looked soft, smooth, and flawless. Without hesitation, my fingers glided over the soft skin of his hand. Sparks danced along my fingertips, sending a wave of relaxation through me. "This makes me feel calm," Giovanni murmured, his eyes locked on our hands. "Is that part of the mate bond?" "Yes." I nodded, my eyes trailing over his face. The frustration on his face was gone as he watched my fingers trail over his skin. And the strange feeling running across my skin. Giovanni's eyes snapped up to my own. "That's also the mate bond?" I nodded by his intense gaze. "The feeling lets you know you've found them, your other half." "How can a vampire be your other half?" Giovanni grimaced, giving a quick shake of his head. "I don't know," I answered honestly, already craving another touch. I continued running my fingers over his hand as he made no move to stop me. With each caress, my own restraint evaporated. My wolf was in awe, taken in by the man who claimed half our soul. She was determined to pretend. Pretend there was nothing else outside these walls. There was only Giovanni and I, only my mate and me. It was easy to get into her thoughts, wanting to believe the same. When Giovanni leaned into my touch, stepping closer to my body, my mind still hadn't begun to clear. I could feel the heat from his body, begging to meet my own. My fingers trailed up his clothed arms, grazing the skin of his neck. His dark eyes were blown wide, lingering on the sparks that caressed his skin. I saw *ked in a sharp breath as my fingers trailed up his neck, dancing along his curly hair. The moment I felt Giovanni's hands on my hips, I knew we were both lost. Giovanni leaned down, and I pressed myself against him as our lips clashed together. His lips were hot against my own, something I hadn't expected. My hands tangled in his curly hair, marveling at how soft it felt. While I was tall for a girl, I was small against his huge frame. His hands grasped my hips tightly, as though he were making sure I had been real. Our lips moved against each other's effortlessly, the emotions we suppressed guiding us. His touch sent a fire crawling across my skin, begging to be relieved. "This has been a mistake," Giovanni grunted, tearing himself from me. I could see the toll it had taken on him. A sharp pang of pain radiated throughout my chest. "We're mates for a reason." I was grasping at straws, pleading for some way to make this work. "There is no reason." Giovanni's eyes hardened as he took a few steps away from me. "Neither of us will ever change sides. We can still meet here." The words left my lips before I could even process them. "How, little she-wolf?" Giovanni hissed, his eyes darkening. "Would we ignore our own kind? Pretend there is not a war brewing?" It was stupid, so stupid. And yet I couldn't stop myself. "That's exactly what we do." I clamped my lips together as the words came out. We don't have to talk about what's going on when we're here. It can be somewhere safe for the two of us. Until I'm able to sway your loyalty." The words I had almost spoke lingered in my head. I had no choice, I had to sway his loyalty. The only other option was impossible to think of. Giovanni looked unconvinced. "The odds of this ending badly are high, little she-wolf." Giovanni frowned, nearly making me wince. "I know," I admitted, and yet I couldn't help but hope. ********** I had returned to the house a couple nights later, after Lola had been moved into the pack house. I had spent days resisting the urge to drive off, running to my aunt's house in hopes Giovanni would be there. Some nights I would lie awake, remembering the feel of his lips against my own. I couldn't bring myself to ask my mom about vampire mates. Her face would contort in confusion as she asked why I wanted the information. I already knew what she would say. She would claim we had no more texts on vampires. She had no idea I knew about her secret stash. Information so old she kept it under tight lock and key. Only her and my dad had the privilege of seeing this information. I wanted to sneak off and find a way to access the information, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure I wanted to read what it said. Would it doom us? We were already doomed according to Giovanni. Could it save us? I wasn't sure anything could. Chapter 55. I had finally given in the night Lola moved into the pack house. I had taken Mason home and went home myself. Tonight was another night I was still in my bed. Sleep refused to claim me, instead placing images of Giovanni in my mind. My soul had found its other half and being away from him was nearing painful. When the frustration had become too much, I leaped from the bed. My mom was already asleep, her soft snores floating down the hall. I couldn't even bring myself to change, leaving the house in my pajamas. I sped down the road, disregarding the speed limit signs. My soul and Wolf knew where I was headed, the two of them wanted to get there quickly. Unknowingly, I reached out with my heart. I was searching for Giovanni, silently pleading as I hoped he would come to the house. The windows were dark as I pulled into the driveway for the second time. I found myself sitting in my aunt's armchair, sleep refusing to claim me. I felt wired and awake, sleep the farthest thought from my mind. When Giovanni silently stepped through the door an hour later, I launched myself at him. His body stiffened as I slammed into his chest, but the anticipation had been building for too long. I knew this was wrong, deep down I knew it. My mind and body were at war with each other, claiming they both knew what was best. I would never betray Lola or my pack, but surely, I deserved these few moments of peace. These were all I had until the inevitable happened. Either Giovanni chose me, or he chose his kind. Little she-wolf. Giovanni cleared his throat, taking a step back from me. I felt you reaching out to me. I didn't know what I was doing. I frowned, I had to come here. I was at a loss for words, but it seemed Giovanni was in the same situation. I have been feeling things for you. Giovanni cleared his throat again, his eyes flashing with reluctance. It has been difficult staying away from this house. I know. I breathed, my eyes roaming every inch of him. It's been hard for me too. I couldn't stay away any longer. Giovanni's lips parted to say something but closed shortly after. I took his hesitation and tossed it to the side. I knew what I wanted, and right now I wanted to pretend. I wanted to pretend he wasn't a vampire, and I wasn't a werewolf. We were just two normal people who happened to share a connection. I wanted just a moment of this before reality crashed down, guilt following. I threw my arms over his shoulders and pressed myself against him. He was too tall for me to reach his lips, so I freckled light kisses across his jaw. His body tensed under my touch, but he made no move to distance himself. I knew I had won when his arms around my waist, pulling myself tighter against him. His head bent down, his lips meeting my own. I could feel the emotion he held back, the hunger that hid behind his eyes. Somewhere in the back of my mind, my logical side was screaming. I was kissing a vampire in the middle of nowhere. He could dr me and leave my body to rot. It could be quite some time until my mom thought to look here. Much too soon, Giovanni pulled himself from me. He looked as though he wanted to say something, something important. Little she-wolf. Giovanni's lips were parted, practically begging for another taste. This cannot continue. Things have been set into motion. You will not be able to tolerate my involvement. My stomach sank at his words, and fear coursed through my veins. The way he was speaking made it sound as though the vampires had plans they were involving Giovanni in. What's happening, Giovanni? I frowned, his name tasted sweet on my lips. Something in his eyes flashed as I said his name, the bond between us growing stronger. I will not betray my people. Giovanni's eyes hardened painfully. I just wished to inform you. You can see what they're doing is wrong, right? I frowned, my eyes wide and pleading. The vampires want to end all werewolf life. Werewolves don't want all vampires. We were happy living in peace. You say that as though I am not one of them. Giovanni's voice was cold, detached. I cannot change what I am, nor can you. The backs of my eyes burned, desperately wanting to let the tears run free. I refused to give in to the agony, determined to keep myself together in front of this man. If he could throw a mask on his face and ignore his emotions, so could I. Giovanni turned towards the front door, stepping out onto the porch. His eyes were dark as he turned and looked at me. I follow orders, just as you do. Giovanni's eyes concealed just a flicker of pain before he sped off into the night. I had refused to go back to my aunt's house. My heart stung with pain every time Giovanni crossed my mind. I hated myself for my weakness, and I hated myself for thinking there could be a happy ending. The moment I stepped into my car, the tears fell freely from my face. I had cried the entire drive home, silently demanding answers from the moon goddess. The tears returned with a vengeance when my pleas went unanswered. I would spend my nights alone, drowning in my own emotions as I tried to resist my forbidden mate. During the day I would throw a mask on for the world, one that was being kept together by tape and glue. I summoned what strength I could, hiding my pain from everyone. What hurt me the most was keeping it from Lola. Lola of all people would understand. She wouldn't hate me for what I had done, nor would she expect me to reject Giovanni. She was the one person I could go to, and yet I couldn't force myself to tell her the truth. I hadn't seen Giovanni in days, yet it felt much longer than that. Mason and I had gone through with Lola's plan, sneaking from our houses in the middle of the night. My heart hammered nervously as Mason and I waited alongside the training building. Mason was picking at his fingers, the two of us listening in on Lola through the mind link. My heart dropped when I realized the vampire that had marked Lola was there, Tristan. I could hear Tyler's voice through the mind link, making my blood boil. I had never liked that coward. A strangled gasp left my lips as Lola repeated the names of Tristan's vampire friends. Giovanni. How many vampires named Giovanni were there? My head clamored for an answer, but my heart knew the truth. This was what Giovanni was speaking of. The vampires had a plan for Lola and this pack, one Giovanni was heavily involved with. After calling Alpha Maddox, Mason and I ran around to the back of the pack house. Alpha Maddox darted outside, half-dressed with eyes full of sleep. He said nothing to us, his eyes burning with fury. The fear rolling through me had nothing to do with Alpha Maddox. My fear concerned Giovanni. Alpha Maddox shifted and leaped into the forest, taking off after Lola. I was the second to shift, using all my force to propel myself forward. I could hear Mason's heavy footfalls behind me as I desperately tried to catch up to Alpha Maddox. Alpha Maddox bounded into the clearing, knocking into Tristan roughly. Giovanni locked eyes with me, the bond making him able to notice me in wolf form. His eyes burned intelligently as they stared into my own. I forced myself to look away, to do anything else. Mason and I leaped into the clearing as Tristan darted away. Giovanni was next to follow, bounding into the woods without a second glance. My heart ached at the sight, my legs moving on their own. My wolf had more control when we were in this form, and she was determined not to let Giovanni get away. My legs burned with agony as I chased after Giovanni. His scent swirled in my head, and I let it lead me as I ran. I skidded to a halt, kicking up dirt and grass in my attempt to stop. Giovanni was leaning against a tree, his eyes hard. His arms were crossed as he stared at me. I wanted to shift but remained still in fear he would dart away. A low whine left my lips, one that seemed to thaw Giovanni's icy exterior. "I cannot speak with you this way," Giovanni murmured, his eyes running over my wolf form. I walked behind one of the trees, letting my fur sprout back into my body. Keeping my eyes on where Giovanni stood, I walked over to one of the trees. Many of the trees in our woods had colored markers. These were the places clothes were set out in case they were needed. I slipped on a pair of loose sweatpants and threw a white t-shirt over my head. My heart fluttered painfully as I realized Giovanni hadn't left, he had waited for me. Alpha Maddox Desmond has Tyler in his possession, I assume? Giovanni questioned. I figured it couldn't hurt to answer his question, so I answered honestly. He does. I nodded. Giovanni grunted, frustration flashing in his eyes. You don't have to do this. I shook my head, you could just come with me. Come with you. Giovanni scoffed, and then what? I would be MDR for my involvement, and for what I am. I wouldn't let that happen. I shook my head, my throat constricting as my heart ached in my chest. Lola would help us, she'd understand. The half-blood might understand, but she would never accept us. Giovanni's gaze became detached, that same echo of pain flickering in his eyes. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered how much pain a person could take. My heart felt DD in my chest, sharp pains radiating throughout my body. For once the part of me that wanted a happy ending fell silent. I was left with nothing, just a hollow feeling in my chest. I felt resentment towards Giovanni. Resentment mixed with desire, anger mixed with sorrow. I reject you, Giovanni, as my mate. My voice was hollow, my wolf howling and my heart aching as I uttered the words that would sever the bond. Giovanni took a step back, as if my words were a physical strike against his skin. The mask on his face cracked, giving in to the whirlwind of emotions he felt. Anger, regret, longing, despair. He hid it so much better than I, but he was feeling the same emotions. He wanted me as badly as I wanted him. I couldn't blame him for not wanting to try. I was unwilling to abandon my people. How could I expect him to do the one thing I could not? Accept my rejection. I choked out, blinking back the tears that threatened to leave my eyes. Giovanni stood silent, an echo of pain flitting across his features. Giovanni backed away from me, moving deeper into the forest. Reject me, Giovanni. The words tore from my chest in a painful yell. Giovanni gave me one last look, one filled with everything he knew he couldn't have. He turned and darted into the forest, leaving me broken and confused. He hadn't accepted my rejection. The mate bond was still growing stronger. Chapter 56. Alpha Maddox's P.O.V. I reluctantly let Lola leave the house, hoping she would somehow manage to stay out of trouble. The moment Lola left the house, I traveled down to the cells to speak with Tyler. I was forced to use the holding cells in this pack, missing the ones in my own desperately. The holding cells in this pack were pitiful in comparison. Silver bars and dirt walls were all that kept prisoners in line. It was obvious these cells were rarely used. The cell bars were rusting, the smell of damp earth surrounding us. I had brought my beta along, hoping the two of us would coax some words from Tyler. We had kept Tyler under tight lock and key. Guards monitored his cell constantly, they also injected small amounts of silver into his bloodstream. He was kept weak and isolated in hopes his mind would break before his body. I had visited Tyler the night we captured him and saved Lola. He had refused to speak, demanding he talk to Lola. The demand sent fury rolling through me. Tyler was not in any position to make demands, nor would he speak with what was mine. Tyler had this petty hold over Lola, claiming they were meant to be together. I had heard the rumors floating around the day after I took control of this pack. The old alpha had a girlfriend but discovered his true mate in the middle of his relationship. I walked down to the cells with Beta Devon at my side. Two guards were leaning against the earthen wall, watching Tyler through the bars. Has he said anything useful yet? I turned to one of the men, my eyes flickering to Tyler's hunched form. No, Alpha. One of the guards shook his head, his eyes narrowing in hatred as he looked on at Tyler. I recognized one of the guards from my own pack, the other was once a part of Tyler's pack. The hatred in his eyes was staggering, especially as he looked down at his old alpha. I remembered the young werewolf's name. Isaac had once been close friends with the old alpha, making me reluctant to accept his offer as a guard. It was his hatred for his old alpha that made me accept, and Isaac had not been one to disappoint. Every half an hour, Isaac would enter Tyler's cell and beat the truth from him. Tyler had yet to speak of anything other than Lola, but my will remained unbroken. It had been a total of 2 days, longer than I thought Tyler would last. Bringing Lola down here was a last resort, something I tried not to think on. I opened Tyler's cell and stepped inside. The smell was overwhelming, turning my stomach. Tyler had seen better days. The cocky tilt of his chin was absent as he sat slumped over in his cell. His light-colored hair was brown with dirt, his clothes crumpled and stained. His light eyes remained bright and unbroken, something that would soon change. "It appears your men have forgotten my breakfast." Tyler's voice was raspy from lack of water, his head turning up in my direction. His eyes were bright as his lips turned up in a cocky smile. My wolf wanted to tear through, to destroy the man that laid claim on what was ours. Tyler's hold on Lola was non-existent, a power he wished to reclaim. Tyler was one of those men who couldn't stand to be ignored, to be replaced by something better. Reclaiming Lola was poor attempt to claim his old life, one where he hadn't lost everything. It was never my intention to AK Tyler's pack. I hadn't noticed the little pack until Tyler climbed for my attention. I could ignore his side-eyed looks of jealousy and superiority, but I couldn't tolerate outright disrespect. Tyler had disrespected my position in front of my pack. Naturally, an act like this wouldn't be grounds for war. The two alphas would fight one-on-one, the victor absorbing the loser's pack. Tyler had run back to his pack before we had the chance, prompting my own action in return. I could never allow another alpha to disrespect me and run. A coward had no right running a pack. Instead of acknowledging what he said, I kept my face an impassive mask. I gripped Tyler's tattered shirt in my fist, lifting him to his feet. His head rested against the earthen wall, his lips split from his time with Isaac. Feeling my wolf's strength surge through me, I tossed Tyler's body against the wall. His flesh hit the earth with a sickening smack, but the light in his blue eyes remained. "Not for long," my wolf murmured, looking down at the would-be alpha. "Everyone breaks." As much as I wanted to, I hadn't the time to stay and truly torture Tyler. I informed Isaac and the other guard to feed him scraps a few times a day. Enough to keep him alive, but not enough to gain strength. Alpha Bran had been waiting outside the training building for me, insisting he needed my men's aid in setting up for the fight. I had detested Alpha Bran's father, and now I detested his son. The two of them were insufferable pricks, thinking themselves the kings of the world. While the prospect of Lola fighting Alpha Bran pissed me off, it would be satisfying when she won. Alpha Bran will never live it down. My wolf murmured in appreciation. Alpha Bran continued to push his boundaries. Extensive comments about Lola and his night with her left his mouth. He was goading me on, I knew that much. Alpha Bran's pride often clouded his judgment. He ran the second largest pack in the world, one I could easily absorb if need be. I had been quite the dictator a few years ago, my goal was absorbing as many packs as possible. I had long ago left that goal behind, content with the size of my pack. We had the numbers and the warriors, there was just one thing missing. It was something I had spent many years ignoring, something I wasn't sure I wanted. I had the pack, the men, but I didn't have a mate. I needed a Luna. Alpha Bran's men worked with my own, turning the open space beside the pack house into a fighting ground. The open space lingered beside the training building and was once where training was held. When the recruits began their training as wolves, we would move outside. The space was flat and barren, but Alpha Bran requested more. After a couple hours, the earthen floor was covered. In the center of the field sat a large dirt lot, circular in shape. This was where Alpha Bran and Lola would be fighting. Large lights were strewn about, staked into the ground. The sun was just beginning to set, marking only an hour before their fight. I paced inside the pack house as the minutes ticked by. 10 minutes before the fight, I was nearly ready to explode. Her two friends had come 20 minutes earlier, standing by as they waited for their friend. The girl Brianna continued throwing me anxious glances. Her eyes were glued to the clock on the wall, counting down the seconds until the fight. Even the guy Mason looked concerned. The constant need to suppress my jealousy around Mason was infuriating, but I knew Lola needed them here. She'll be here, Alpha. Beta Devin grunted, giving me a wary look. Do you really think Lola would run? No, I don't. I shook my head, agreeing with Beta Devin's reasoning. She's incapable of arriving anywhere on time. She'll be here. Brianna muttered, her eyes meeting my own. She went to her dad's house, they're probably just running late. You know how she is. As if on cue, the front door opened, and Lola walked in. Her face was red from exertion, but she was otherwise unharmed. My hammering heart stilled at the sight of her black hair done in a tight braid down her back. The black leggings and sports bra clung to her full frame. Did you run here? I grimaced, taking in the sight of her. What? No, I didn't run here. Lola's face contorted in confusion, her bottom lip jutting out. We were just running late. You're about to fight an alpha and you couldn't keep track of the time. My voice came out harsher than I meant, my eyebrow lifting as I stared at the defiant expression on Lola's face. Baby steps, Alpha. Lola snapped, her hands finding their way to her hips. Rome wasn't built in a day. I peeled my eyes away from her hips and glared. This little ball of fire was distracting me more than I thought. I was noticing all her habits and began enjoying each one. Her lip would jut out in a pout whenever she was being scolded, her hands would find her hips when she became defensive. I was beginning to enjoy the flash of fire in her eyes when she called me Alpha. I sent Brianna, Mason, and Beta Devin outside. I needed a minute alone with Lola before my head nearly imploded. The urge to touch her skin was a constant itch in my head. Ready to watch me beat up an alpha. Lola's lips turned up in a smirk that sent my heart hammering. You're awful cocky. My eyes blazed down at her, irritation and filling my body. Her eyes were wide and innocent, catching on to the anger that rolled from my body. Regardless of tonight's outcome, Lola would be punished for her behavior. Maybe I just have a really good alpha training me. Lola shrugged, her own filling her eyes. As much as she tried to resist me, her eyes always gave it away. Careful, Lola. I smirked down at her, my thumb rubbing against her plush bottom lip. Keep complimenting me, and I might just think you like me. Lola had the reaction I anticipated. A scoff came from her perfect lips, her eyes narrowing incredulously. Keep dreaming. Lola smirked, turning on her heel and exiting through the front door. Her hips swayed, her bottom prominent through her leggings. I ignored the tightening in my pants, pushing thoughts of Lola's round bottom from my mind. I had caught up to Lola effortlessly. Lola was fast for a werewolf, but it was clear she was in no hurry. Some part of her was nervous for this fight. Alpha Brand stood in the middle of the dirt circle, his face bright with cheer as he talked to some of the guests. I could see Alpha Zeke nearby, an irritated look on his face as Alpha Brand clapped him on the back. Alpha Brand was the first to notice Lola's arrival, something I had already anticipated. Lola's dad stood off to the side, looking irritated yet proud. Her grandma stood nearby, her face calm and serene despite what tonight would hold. Lola sweetheart, you're here. Alpha Brand smirked, running a hand through his hair. His pitiful excuse at flirting only irritated me and my wolf. Lola's look of disgust cooled some of my anger. Obviously, this is my pack. Lola rolled her eyes, clearly tired of his antics. I'm afraid I can't go easy on you, sweetheart. Alpha Brand smirked, pulling his shirt from his head. Many of the guests stood by awkwardly, anticipation and nerves filling the lot of them. It wasn't often one of their own would fight against an alpha. The rules were as such: they could fight in wolf or human form but had to keep within the circle. The first one unconscious or would win the fight. An uneasy feeling filled me. It was clear Lola received training in her year away from the pack, but had she trained in her wolf form? The two of them stood at opposite ends of the circle, their eyes locked on one another. I made my way to the front, taking my place beside Alpha Zeke and Beta Devon. It was responsibility to begin the fight. I let any emotion drain from my face, giving Lola a long look before beginning the match. Fight! My voice rang out through the crowd of people. The lights illuminated the field as the sun continued to set. Shadows were thrown across the field and forest line. Without hesitation, Alpha Bran leaped forward. His claws extended in the short amount of time it took to reach Lola. For just a moment, I worried she had a moment to slow when registering Alpha Bran's AK. Surprise rolled through me as Lola turned, flattening herself as Alpha Bran whizzed by. His claws dug into the ground as he skidded to a halt. His blue eyes were bright with surprise, clearly underestimating Lola. Lola on the other hand looked elated and calm. Alpha Bran pulled himself from the ground. I knew his wolf was giving him speed and strength, judging from the speed Alpha Bran used. A wolf's energy was not inexhaustible. Sooner or later his wolf would tire, retreating to the back of his mind. Alpha Bran kept close to Lola, giving her little room to escape and move around. While Alpha Bran was not the best fighter I had seen, he was better than I anticipated. Alpha Bran threw punch after punch, while Lola stumbled to dodge his moves. He was keeping her close, working her against the far wall of the circle. Lola needed room to move, room to dodge his attacks. My chest constricted as his lengthened claw grazed Lola's ankle. The move had set her off balance, leaving her falling to the floor. Lola pulled herself up with speed that surprised me. As Alpha Bran's punches and swipes became more desperate, Lola began to pick up speed. I watched as something flashed from the corner of my eye, turning my head at the sight. Something cold rushed through me as I watched the shadows gather. They followed Lola's every movement, keeping out of sight behind the crowd. The shadows followed her silkily, as if they were under her command. When Lola lunged and dodged, the shadows followed. What had once been a warm night, was now cold. Light wind whipped around, lashing against skin. A sense of unease fell on the crowd, but I seemed the only one who noticed. My eyes scanned the oblivious crowd, their eyes locked on Lola and Alpha Bran. There was one set of eyes that were not on the fight, but on the gathering shadows behind Lola. Lola's grandmother stared at the gathering shadows, her mouth parted in shock. Chapter 57. Lola's P.O.V. Alpha Bran had quickly learned not to underestimate me. He hadn't expected my speed, having to push himself to land the easiest of blows. Alpha Bran was a skilled opponent, but I had trained against Alpha Maddox on multiple occasions. Alpha Maddox's fighting style was brute force coupled with intense analyzing. Alpha Maddox analyzed each target, noticing their differences in the way they fought. Alpha Bran did no such thing, treating me the same as he would any other opponent. While dodging Alpha Bran's attacks, I remembered something Chris had told me. Chris had trained me the entire year I stayed at Grandma's. He had never told me the truth about his past, but Grandma gave me some hints. Chris had been one of the best warriors to exist, becoming beta to his closest friend at one point. It must have not worked out, as Chris lived in the middle of nowhere with Grandma as his neighbor. Chris had given me thousands of tips throughout our year of training, but this one stuck with me the most. Each opponent is different. You need to pinpoint those differences, find their weak spot. Alpha Brand's weak spot was his pride, that and his increasing temper. The more impatient and desperate Alpha Brand became, the sloppier he would fight. Parts of his body were undefended as he attacked impulsively. I could see Alpha Brand's desire to shift, yet his pride prevented him from doing so. He thought shifting was unnecessary, fighting against a she-wolf, that he should have the strength in human form. Maya was in my head, goading me on. While she helped increase my speed, she saved her strength. We would have to render Alpha Brand unconscious to win the fight. It was clear he was stronger than me, but I was determined to win. As I became faster, Alpha Brand's blows became more desperate. I was exceeding his expectations, proving to be a challenge. No one else could see it, but anger and frustration were growing in Alpha Brand's eyes. I felt myself tumble to the ground, my ankle scratched by Alpha Brand's claw. I could feel the sticky wetness against my ankle, but the pain fueled me. All at once, something strange began to happen. It started as a gentle tingling sensation across my skin, brushing past the hairs on my arms and raising them. The tingling sensation grew stronger, and much colder. Shards of ice danced across my skin, scraping but causing no pain. The sweat on my body grew cold, yet Alpha Brand and I continued to fight. My stomach tightened as I dodged another of Alpha Brand's blows. He was close to shifting, to setting aside his pride to win the fight. It'll be easier to knock him out before he shifts. Maya murmured in my head. There was a tugging sensation in my gut, and the cold shards of ice continued running across my skin. A voice whispered out in my mind, silky yet sharp like steel. It slithered into my mind, curling around my head like a vice. I could almost picture it sliding into my mind, a smoky tendril of darkness. By payment of blood, we will provide aid. As quickly as the voice had come, it vanished. A searing pain erupted from my ankle, and it took all my concentration not to double over. The cut on my ankle grew cold, painfully cold. Instead of strength leaving my body, I was met with a wave of strength that nearly knocked me to my knees. The feeling was raw and dark yet alluring and almost comforting. It reminded me of dark chocolate, thick and sweet with just a hint of something bitter. Alpha Brand's face contorted in panic as my speed skyrocketed. I was dodging Alpha Brand's reckless blows while making ones of my own. His contorted expression fueled me, filling me with smug satisfaction as my claws grazed his chest. Alpha Brand's bones began to shift, hair sprouting on his body in light patches. Faster than the average werewolf, his wolf burst from his body. Large and the color of wet sand, Alpha Brand stood snarling at me. I called Maya forward, and for just a moment she fought against the strength that filled me. The humming pain in my ankle was an afterthought, hardly crossing my mind. It feels wrong. Maya mumbled, shaking her head. Do you want to get beat by this Alpha? I grunted, growing impatient the longer we stayed in human form. I felt Maya come to the front of my mind, absorbing and meshing with the strength that flowed through me. My own bones began to shift, midnight-colored fur sprouting over my body. Maya jumped forward with renewed strength, our jaws open as we fought for each other's throats. The crowd of people stepped back, out of range from the fighting wolves. I hadn't the time to stop and analyze, but I felt different in wolf form. My wolf had grown taller, almost as tall as Alpha Brand's. I was still small in comparison, but it was a noticeable change. My fur had once been a flat shade of black, looked brighter and more alive. It was a deep black, with almost a deep blue hue. Alpha Brand's strength began to wane, his desperation reaching newfound heights. Alpha Brand's wolf lunged forward, he made the mistake of leaving his right side open, and I was much faster. I felt Maya spring forward, coiling her body away from Alpha Bran's teeth as our own sunk into his neck. We hadn't bitten deep enough to KL, just enough to make Alpha Bran whine. Planting our back legs in the dirt, Maya whipped her head to the side. I forced all the strength coursing through me into the move. Alpha Bran hit the dirt with a sickening thud. The force behind our move sent his wolf skidding across the grass. The crowd held its breath, their eyes flickering between Alpha Bran and I. Alpha Zeke walked over to the still wolf, a cocky grin on his face. I hadn't noticed what Alpha Zeke was doing, my eyes were locked on Alpha Maddox. His honey-colored eyes stared at me, something strange flickering on the surface. My body felt strangely numb, my limbs thick with exhaustion. All I wanted was to curl up in Alpha Maddox's plush bed and sleep well into the next day. He's done. Alpha Zeke chuckled, a brisk shake of his head. After copious amounts of cheering and a few more strange looks from Alpha Maddox, I was finally able to step out of the crowd. I stumbled at first, nearly toppling over as a wave of exhaustion hit. The high from my fight was wearing off. Once I was away from most of the people, I closed my eyes and sent Ela back. "What are you doing, Lola?" Alpha Maddox's rough voice called out, making my eyes snap open. My wolf was almost as tall as Alpha Maddox, my head reaching around his chest. "Shifting." I scoffed through the mind link, giving Alpha Maddox a tired look. "Come in the training building with me." Alpha Maddox grunted, holding my bag in his hands. I followed Alpha Maddox silently, my paws tapping against the thick pads on the floor. The lights were off inside, all coming on at once as Alpha Maddox flipped the switches. Once the door was closed, Alpha Maddox turned to me. His voice was rough and commanding. I'm sure Maya would have done anything he asked, so long as he used that tone. The fur retreated from my body, my bones shifting back with minimal discomfort. My long raven-colored hair hung down to my waist, covering most of my chest as I stood in front of Alpha Maddox. "Later, Lola." Alpha Maddox smirked, his dark eyes captivating. "Your family is waiting outside." My face flushed, and for a moment I wondered if he could read my thoughts. Alpha Maddox pulled my spare set of clothes from my bag, slipping my loose t-shirt over my head. I pulled on another pair of leggings and slipped on some shoes. I was pissed I ripped through my clothes when I shifted, but I couldn't get undressed in the middle of a fight. That didn't change the fact I lost my favorite pair of shoes during my shift. The two of us walked outside, images of Alpha Maddox and I flickering through my head. Dad, Mason, and Brianna all had cheeky grins on their faces. "I didn't doubt you for a second, Lola." Mason's lopsided smile formed on his face. "I did." Brianna shrugged, a grin on her own face. "But I'm pleasantly surprised." Grandma pasted a smile on her face, one I could see through in an instant. Her eyes were filled to the brim with worry, her hands clasped tightly. "You did great out there." Grandma smiled proudly. Her smile seemed a little more convincing this time but did nothing to ease the tension in my stomach. Chapter 58. While everyone seemed elated over my victory, my stomach continued twisting in knots. Clearly something had happened during the fight, something that chilled me to the bone. I hadn't won on my own, something had helped me. If I tried to picture the source, I could see smoky tendrils of darkness pulsing at the edge of the forest. They blended in with the shadows, nearly invisible to the eye. If I focused hard enough, I swore I could see them moving. The strange surge of strength put Maya on edge. She hated the cold and prickly feeling that caressed our skin. It felt seductive and cold, unfeeling yet addicting. While I hadn't a clue what I did, I promised myself that would be the last of it. Alpha Maddox's eyes lingered on the forest line, flickering back to me as he caught my gaze. Something turned in my stomach at the way Alpha Maddox looked on at the shadows. My gut was telling me he could see them, slithering into the darkness until called. Even Grandma looked uneasy, her lips turned up into a forced smile. Every now and again her eyes would run over me slowly, as if she were searching for something. Alpha Bran had been placed out of sight, still unconscious in his wolf form. A sense of smug satisfaction filled me. I had defeated an Alpha. Alpha Bran was a far cry away from Alpha Maddox, but I had been successful. Alpha Maddox would receive aid from Alpha Bran, and I didn't have to spend a night with the man. Once everyone cleared from the training grounds, Alpha Maddox and I retreated inside the house. I hugged Brianna and Mason goodbye, promising to meet up with them tomorrow after training. Dad and Grandma had left, Dad's shoulders lifting with pride as they walked back to the car. I walked into Alpha Maddox's bedroom without being told, the action simply felt right. After spending these few days with him, I couldn't imagine sleeping in bed alone. It was strange how attached I became to Alpha Maddox, relying on his presence like a crutch. After a while, I stopped questioning the intense soul attraction I felt towards the man. Now something new was simmering within me. Every intimate move Alpha Maddox made was stored in my mind, igniting feelings I hadn't expected. These feelings weren't born from lust and allure, but something deeper. Choosing to focus on anything other than those feelings, I asked Alpha Maddox what happened during the fight. Did anything strange happen while I was fighting Alpha Bran? I frowned, the words tasting sour in my mouth. Alpha Maddox lifted my shirt from my head, another intimate action. I was keeping count at this point, each action making my insides flutter. Alpha Maddox insisted we shower but noticed how I seemed to wobble on my own feet. He was incredibly gentle, removing each piece of my clothing with ease. I could hardly feel his fingertips graze my skin as he removed my bra. Alpha Maddox's lips pressed together tightly, an expression I was beginning to anticipate. His dark brows pressed together, worry clouding his honey-colored eyes. Strange? Alpha Maddox murmured, his voice rough. You could say that. Did you notice anything strange? It was my turn to purse my lips. I had learned my lesson about telling Alpha Maddox the truth. If I lied to him, it would only come back to bite me. I told Alpha Maddox about what happened during the fight. I gave every insignificant detail I could muster. I gave a detailed description on how the small shards of ice danced across my skin, and the searing pain that erupted in my ankle. My ankle had already begun to heal, a red puckered wound lingering on my skin. Alpha Maddox's jaw clenched when I told him what the shadows had said, and how they fed from my blood. My stomach churned as I spoke, but I told him what the surge of power felt like. It was raw and ancient, yet dark and seductive. It was easy to become lost in that power, letting it flow unrestricted. That doesn't sound good. Alpha Maddox's eyes darkened, the muscles in his jaw working roughly. My pants hit the floor with a dull thud. It was clear Alpha Maddox had seen something during the fight, something he was reluctant to speak of. The pulse of allure and bounced between us, but our thoughts kept us occupied. Alpha Maddox placed his hands on my hips and lifted me from the floor. As if it were second nature, I wrapped my legs around his hips. He walked the two of us into the shower and set me on my wobbly legs. The hot water eased my bruised skin wonderfully, lulling me into a sleepy daze. I forced myself to remain awake, to continue the conversation we were having. What could it have been? I murmured warily, they spoke in my head, like I was the one who called them. Werewolves can't do things like that, Lola. Alpha Maddox pursed his lips, grabbing a bottle of body wash to lather over my skin. That means what happened probably stemmed from your other half, your vampire side. I'm not sure I want to know. I frowned, my wide eyes meeting his own. That kind of power felt wrong, yet incredibly alluring. I felt strong harnessing this ancient power, but I could feel it leave a stain on my soul. That kind of power was addicting. It's half of who you are. Alpha Maddox smiled wearily. You do not have to accept that side, but it is smart to learn what you can. Brianna's parents are big into history. They have all these ancient texts, but they still didn't have much on vampires. I frowned. I can see what I can do on my part. Alpha Maddox spun me around, rubbing the soft sponge against my back. I make no promises. Many alphas do not care for history. That's not a surprise. I snorted, my eyes closing against my own will. Alpha Maddox set the sponge aside, letting his large hands glide over my shoulders. His thumbs dug into the sore muscles on my shoulders, coaxing a tired moan from my lips. His hands paired with the hot water soothed my body, making me weak to the knees. I'd suggest you hold those sounds in, Lola. Alpha Maddox murmured, his lips only inches from my ear. You're too exhausted for what I want to do to you. I could feel his length press against my back, hardened from the noise that left my lips. My cheeks burned red, but Alpha Maddox continued running his hands along my back. I clamped my lips shut, letting Alpha Maddox's hands work away my tension. It was another intimate act, another moment where things felt much more serious. Talk to Brianna again. Alpha Maddox murmured, my eyes began fluttering shut. Reread what you've already read. I've learned coming back later can offer fresh perspective. I murmured something unintelligible, my head falling back against Alpha Maddox's chest. The rest of the shower was a daze, my eyes refusing to stay open for the rest. Every so often, I could feel Alpha Maddox run his fingers along my skin. The move wasn't *****, his fingers stayed far away from my private areas. Alpha Maddox trailed his fingers up my neck, along my collarbones and down my stomach. His arm wrapped around my waist, holding me up as he massaged conditioner into my hair. He had been incredibly gentle, taking control and cleaning every inch of me. My eyes might have been closed and fighting sleep, but my stomach swarmed with butterflies. Sleepy, little Lola. Alpha Maddox chuckled lowly in my ear, sending a pang of something delightful between my legs. His voice continued to have a strong affect on me. Your clever move must have left you drained. Alpha Maddox was right, my move had left me drained. The strength that once flowed through my body had left with a vengeance. As that dark power left me, I felt as though it away my own strength. The last thing I remembered to the darkness, was the feel of a soft material beneath my fingers. I could feel Alpha Maddox's fingers in my hair, the motion lulling me into sleep. I was envious of the confidence in Alpha Maddox's voice. While he didn't put it into words, he trusted me. He might have not trusted my ability to stay out of trouble, but he trusted my loyalty. He wasn't worried about the dark power I had tapped into, confident we would find the answer. I wished I could feel that way, but his confidence did nothing to ease the anxiety in my gut. My sleep started off as restful that was until the slippery voices filled my mind. I felt myself being torn from my body, pulled away from Alpha Maddox's bed. I could see my body below, curled up as I breathed softly. Alpha Maddox's face was smooth and relaxed, his own eyes closed in sleep. I wanted to reach forward, to go back into my body, but the shadows stirring in the corner had other plans. They pulled me backwards, ripping me from Alpha Maddox's bedroom with force. I tumbled out of the house, several feet above the ground before plummeting forward. Chapter 59. I was pulled from the pack house, floating just outside the second-floor window. I could still see Alpha Maddox and I in bed, his arm wrapped lazily around my waist. Looking down at my own hands, I noticed the shimmery and almost dreamlike quality they had taken on. My skin was nearly translucent, showing the ground beneath me. I held my arms out in the air, trying to move myself towards the bedroom window. My body refused to respond, as if I were tethered to the spot. I had never experienced a dream quite like this. Watching my sleeping body just 10 feet away was quite unsettling. My stomach lurched as I began sinking to the ground. It felt like going over the crest of a roller coaster, right before free fall. For just a second, I wondered if my feet would pass through the earth. I had passed through the pack house with ease. Some of the fear in my stomach was quenched when my feet gently hit the ground. Everything was lit beautifully under the night sky. The moonlight bathed everything in shades of deep blue. Something stirred at the forest line. I tried to take a step back when the familiar icy cold front lapped at my skin. I couldn't force my body to move, once again tethered in place. After seeing the moving shadows during the fight, it was easy to spot them now. It was as if once you noticed the shadows, you could never miss them again. The shadows gathered along the forest line, painting the leaves and bark in black. I watched as some of the shadows took form, only to break apart and slink away. The shadows continued to build, and my discomfort continued to grow. My skin was cold to the touch, even with the warm nighttime breeze. As the shadows gathered, other parts of the forest line became lighter. Trees and details were easier to make out as the shadows pulled themselves further away. The shadows merged, creating a towering form. The form was shaped like a man. Standing at 6 feet tall, the form had no discernible details. I could see its frayed edges, where the shadows were unable to become solid. The human-shaped shadow approached me. Each individual hair on my body stood on end as the silky voice emerged from the shadow. The cold front seemed to follow the shadows, growing stronger the closer they approached. "You have been called." My voice sounded strange as the word tumbled from my lips. It was an octave higher and left a dull ringing in my ears. As much as I wanted this to be a dream, it was far too accurate for my liking. The knot that had formed in my stomach grew bigger each time I dismissed this as a dream. While I wanted to ignore the truth, my gut already knew. I tried to reach out to Maya, to feel her within the confines of my brain. I was met with an emptiness that rattled me. Searching the corners of my mind for my wolf, she was nowhere to be found. The only voice inside my head was my own. I pressed against the invisible barrier that held me in place, pushing until my body ached and my head throbbed. The shadow man glided forward inhumanly, its arms and legs remained still throughout the motion. "Do not fight," the words came from the shadows in a silky hiss, their voices floating to my reluctant ears. Before I had the chance to react, a smoky hand wrapped around my wrist. My mouth opened in pain, but nothing came out. The smoky hand around my wrist was colder than anything I had felt. I couldn't pull myself from its grasp. Icy shards dug into my skin and I wondered if there would be a wound where the shadow had touched me. Nearly 3 whole seconds after the shadow grabbed my wrist, the pack house around us had faded from existence. It was like watching an old television. The background became enveloped in static, details and objects disappearing from the background until we were left with nothing. As quickly as everything faded, a new surrounding replaced the old. My limbs felt like jelly, my tongue sandpaper in my mouth. I was overwhelmed with fatigue, as if I had just traveled a great distance. I turned around, looking at my surroundings as they came into existence. I wasn't by the pack house anymore, but inside someone's home. From the looks of it, I was standing in someone's living room. My body still had that hazy dreamlike quality, but everything around me seemed so real. The living room was bathed in shades of maroon, brown and black. A leather couch sat in the middle of the room, facing a blazing fireplace. I could feel the heat crackle against my skin, its warmth attempting to counteract the cold. Bookshelves lined the walls, a large mahogany desk sat at one end of the room. Statues and works of art were scattered throughout the room, all looking priceless and ancient. Once I finished looking over the room, my eyes fell on a familiar head of blonde hair. Looking much like he had at the swimming hole, Tristan was seated in one of the chairs. A glass of amber-colored alcohol sat in his hand, his face contorted into a grimace. Without giving it much thought, my hand reached up and ran against the mark Tristan left on my shoulder. I knew without looking, it was still there. It had followed me into my dream or whatever this was. My eyes fell on another man, and I wondered how I hadn't noticed him before. He wasn't any vampire I had ever seen, not that I've seen many to begin with. His hair was the color of night, a deep shade of black that nearly grazed his shoulders. The midnight-colored waves seemed oddly familiar. I walked around to get a better look at his face. Neither one seemed to notice my presence. The man's hair was lifted from his face, the deep waves fanned over his head. The man looked quite young, possibly in his late 20s. While he looked young, there was a strange aura that surrounded him. Power and wisdom floated around him like a harsh wind. I was sure my heart ceased its erratic beating the moment I looked into his eyes. What I saw made the icy waves come back with a vengeance. I saw myself mirrored in his bright eyes, my own staring back at me. It was then I was able to make the connection between myself and this man. This man was my father. His bright eyes were identical to my own, his raven hair the same shade. I had always thought I got my dark hair from my grandma, but now I could see the difference. Grandma's black hair was the color of obsidian. My hair was such a deep shade of black, it almost held a blue hue to it. The color of rich midnight skies and lurking shadows. His lips were like my own, plump and full with a deep cupid bow. There was a coldness to the man's eyes, one that set my teeth on edge. His eyes were hard as he looked into the fire. The man turned his head to Tristan, and I watched as Tristan stiffened in response. The man my father commanded a lot of respect, that was evident in the way Tristan responded to his gaze. "You may leave, Tristan." His voice was deep and rich, striking a chord within me that I had long ago forgotten about. His voice was familiar, delving down and reaching memories long ago forgotten. How could I remember his voice if I hadn't met him before? As deep and rich as his voice may be, it reminded me of the icy shards that licked my skin. His voice held a certain coldness to it, one that spread around the room like a thick frost. I was almost certain I'd be able to see my own breath as it escaped my lips. Tristan stood, giving the man a small bow. "Yes, my lord." Tristan murmured politely, retreating to the large doors before he disappeared from the room. "My lord?" The strange words danced in circles around my head. The truth was sitting right in front of me, waiting for me to wrap my hands around it. I couldn't bring myself to put the pieces together. I would much rather live in the dark, ignore the pull I felt in my gut as I looked on at my father. The pieces were fitting together in my head, and it took all my willpower to keep them apart. Just as the pieces clicked together, the man opened his mouth and spoke. "I know you're here, Lola." Bile churned in my stomach, threatening to rise. Could I throw up in a dream or whatever this was? I wasn't sure, but I had the strange feeling I would find out. The icy shards continued lapping at my skin, but the shadow figure had retreated to the other side of the room. The figure melted into the shadows cast by the blazing fireplace. Part of the room darkened as the shadows melted into the background. I opened my mouth to speak, but what could I say? I wasn't sure what to say, let alone if he could hear me. As if the man could read my mind, he spoke once again. I cannot hear you, but that isn't necessary. The man shook his head, his eyes never once leaving the blazing fire. You're a smart girl, I'm sure you've figured out who I am to you. For once, I was thankful I couldn't speak. I hadn't been rendered speechless before, but I was now. There were a million questions flitting through my head, yet none of them seemed to break through the surface. The shadows are your birthright, Lola. They are my gift to you. My father's voice came out strong, his words had an uncomfortable chill to them. I felt you call out to them just a few hours ago. As you have learned, they demand a price for their work. The steeper your request, the higher the price. As he said the last sentence, his head snapped over to me. His eyes were locked on my own, as if he could see me standing in the room. My mouth was open in shock, my body frozen in place. You can deny what you are, but sooner or later you will find your way to me. By force or free will, you will find your way to me. My father's voice was hard. I looked into eyes identical to my own, searching for some form of light within them. Instead of light, I found shadows. Together we will eradicate our enemies. You will take your rightful place at my side. My father spoke with conviction, as if it was all set in stone. It is what you were created for. No, I shook my head, uncaring if he could hear me or not. I won't betray my family, my pack. Embrace your other half, Lola. Look into the past and remember. No. Frustration and fear bubbled within me, the desperate scream tearing through my throat. I didn't want to be here anymore, I wanted to be safe in bed with Alpha Maddox. I could have gone my entire life without seeing that, without experiencing it. I felt myself fly backwards, torn from the place I had stood. My entire body was surrounded by the icy frost, my skin stinging as it tore me away from my father. I was back at the pack house, my toes wiggling over the dewy grass. The shadows against the forest line looked and felt normal. The icy waves that lapped at my skin ceased. I would have thought I was awake if it weren't for my translucent skin. I felt myself being lifted upwards, as if a string were tied around my waist. I was thrown into the bedroom, catching a glimpse of Alpha Maddox's sleeping form. I sat up from bed, my heart hammering in my chest. A thin layer of sweat clung to my skin. While my skin was coated in sweat, I felt like a block of ice. My teeth gnashed together, fighting the urge to shiver. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, battering my eyes from the intensity. Chapter 60. I had woken in bed alone, the spot where Alpha Maddox had been was still warm. His scent swirled around me, settling my frantic heart. A note sat on his pillow, one different to the many I had received. While my heart still thundered at the sight of the note, it was for a different reason. I peeled open the paper and looked down at Alpha Maddox's handwriting. I had to leave early, but figured you'd need the rest. Don't be late for training today, Lola. Maddox. My heart continued its frantic pace as my eyes traced over Alpha Maddox's name. Part of me wondered if I could get away with calling him Maddox now. While I fully planned on testing that theory out, I had other things on my mind. The chill that surrounded me followed as I walked into the bathroom. My eyes had light circles around them, proving I had little sleep. As much as I wanted to write last night off as a hyper-realistic dream, I knew the truth. My father had used the shadows to bring me to him. Part of me wondered why he had only brought my soul, not my body. As you have learned, they demand a price for their work. The steeper your request, the higher the price. His voice twisted and spun in my head, igniting my sense of unease. Perhaps he couldn't pay the price. What would they have asked for? They're just shadows. Shadows that feed on blood. Maya murmured sleepily, bristling against the chill that followed me. Maya hadn't been there with me last night. It was though the shadows had left her behind. At least one of us managed to get some sleep. Do you have any idea what happened last night? I laughed humorlessly. Your thoughts are all over the place, but I can make some sense of them. Maya grunted, obviously unhappy with what had happened. There has to be a way to keep him from doing that again. I don't like being separated from you. I don't like it either. I shook my head, my eyes locked on my own reflection. The scarlet mark stood out brightly on my porcelain skin. It was no longer irritated and looked to be fully healed. The part of me longing for Tristan twitched as I pictured him in my mind. I felt like I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions. I was being pulled towards Alpha Maddox, Tristan, Maya, and my father. I felt as though there were little of me left, not enough to keep for myself. The scarlet mark on my skin tingled invitingly, a sensation I was determined to ignore. I ran out of the bathroom and grabbed my cell phone, pulling up the calendar and counting the days in haste. 1 week and this stupid mark will be gone. I repeated the phrase over and over, until the tingle of the scarlet mark faded from mind. And what if it doesn't? Maya frowned. What if Tristan is our mate? He can't be. I shook my head. Our mate isn't a vampire. I hate it just as much as you, but look at the facts. Maya grimaced, wincing against her own voice. Tristan called your father my lord, which could only mean one thing. I know what it means. I snapped, harsher than I meant. I toned my voice down, feeling guilty for taking my frustration out on Maya. I know what it means, I just don't want to think about it quite yet. Whether you want to think about it or not, the truth is right in front of you. Maya frowned. The sooner we accept the possibilities, the easier it'll be. I don't think it'll be easier at all. I frowned as Maya went silent in my mind. I brushed my teeth and threw on some workout clothes, then headed down to the kitchens. I grabbed myself something light to eat, my stomach much too sensitive for anything heavier. Walking to the training building had taken a total of 3 minutes. People were already entering the building, a few lingering outsides and small CLU* tours. Hey, Lola! An annoyingly familiar voice called out. Ethan strolled up to me, his hair meticulously styled on his head. Why he felt the need to style his hair before training was beyond me. Ethan's cocky aura followed him, as did his overwhelming cologne. Ethan. I nodded, my lips pressed in a thin line. It seems every time Ethan felt the need to speak with me, it always ended in anger. Ethan needed practice in thinking before he spoke more than I did. There's something we can agree on. Maya grunted in approval. On the bright side, we might get to throat punch him again. That is a definite bright side. I nodded appreciatively. I shouldn't be saying this, because you did punch me in the throat. Ethan smirked, flashing what he thought was a dazzling smile. But you fought good yesterday. Thanks. I nodded, my gaze flickering down to his healed throat. I hadn't hit him hard enough to cause lasting damage, hard enough to cause a good bit of pain. Maybe you could train me in private. Ethan's cocky smile appeared on his face. My fist clenched automatically, fueled by Maya's incessant desire to bring Ethan pain. Ethan's eyes flickered down to my fist, caution crossing his gaze. I wouldn't count on that. A smirk formed on my own face. By now, Ethan. After my useless encounter with Ethan, I headed inside the training building. Brianna and Mason were already there, nearly jumping with excitement as they saw me enter the room. Alpha Brand's gonna be here for training. Brianna smirked, her pixie-like features contorting mischievously. From what I heard, he's not too happy you won. His ego's bruised. Mason snickered, that's what he gets for underestimating Lola. Alpha Maddox, Alpha Bran, and Alpha Zeke had all attended training today. Even Luna Freya had attended training today, a sight I wasn't expecting. The three of them walked around the room, showing different techniques and fighting styles. A couple times Alpha Bran would shoot me venomous looks, but I didn't take it to heart. Luna Freya shot me a knowing look, followed by a friendly smile. Alpha Maddox had paired me up with Mason, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. At one point Alpha Zeke had approached Mason and I, stepping in to show us an offensive technique. Mason hit the mat with a thud, and Alpha Zeke stood over him. This technique could be used in wolf or human form. If they were in wolf form, Alpha Zeke's teeth would be locked on Mason's throat. The move sent your opponent tumbling through the air and to the ground. If you don't mind, I'd like to spar against Lola. Alpha Zeke grinned widely, his eyes dancing with excitement. Alpha Zeke comes off as horribly intimidating. With his huge build and massive biceps, not many wolves would mess with someone like Alpha Zeke. My heart hammered in my chest, but I somehow survived against Alpha Maddox. Alpha Maddox was with the three of us in record time and seemed to have been listening in on our conversation. His eyes were hooded and dark as he looked at me, sending a whirlwind of conflicting emotions through me. I wanted to tell him about last night, about where I had gone and who I had talked to. While I wanted to tell him, my mind was still a jumbled mess. I decided I would tell him when I could make better sense of the entire situation. Would you mind, Alpha Maddox? Alpha Zeke turned, giving Alpha Maddox an amused smile. Irritation rolled through me as Alpha Zeke asked Maddox for permission, as if he were asking to borrow a toy Maddox owned. I'm sure he doesn't mind. I grimaced, flashing a look over to Alpha Maddox. His dark eyebrow raised in interest, the corner of his full lips turning up in a smirk. Alpha Zeke chuckled lowly and turned to face me. The two of us got into defensive stances, and I hoped Alpha Zeke was nowhere as skilled as Alpha Maddox. It would *K to spend the rest of the day sore and in pain. Alpha Zeke's skills surpassed Alpha Brand's but was nowhere near Alpha Maddox. While I struggled to keep up with Alpha Zeke, his strength was what I feared most. I had him outmatched with my speed, making it harder for him to land blows. Alpha Zeke managed to land a couple blows, each one knocking the oxygen from my lungs. His giant biceps weren't just for show. As my strength began to wane, I remembered a move Alpha Maddox had shown me. As Alpha Zeke lunged for another hit, I wrapped my hand around his wrist. Using his arm for support, I swung myself onto his back. The move was quite simple, but if you held on tight enough, it was a guaranteed win. I wrapped my arm around Alpha Zeke's neck, pressing it tightly against his windpipe. His hands flew up to my arm, using his remaining strength to peel it off. I knew my arm would be a bruised mess come tomorrow, but I held on for life. Gritting my teeth together and clenching my eyes shut, I didn't let go until Alpha Zeke fell to his knees. Once he hit the mat, I hopped off his back. While I felt exhausted and wobbly on my legs, I forced myself to stand tall. Alpha Zeke took a few deep breaths, a wide grin forming on his face. The grin sent a jolt of surprise running through me. It was unusual for an alpha to be happy with defeat. That was awesome, Lola. Alpha Zeke grinned and shot me a friendly wink. Great job. I expect a rematch in the foreseeable future. Next time you won't win. Alpha Maddox's eyes had darkened as he took in my tired frame. After ending training, Alpha Maddox approached me. It seems Alpha Zeke has grown fond of you. Alpha Maddox's tone held a certain hardness, his eyes searching my face. I have that affect on people. I shrugged, a smirk twitching at my lips. You don't have to be jealous. Jealous? Alpha Maddox scoffed, taking a step towards me. We were only inches away. His husky and woodsy scent swirled around me, igniting a fire deep in my stomach. Every time I look at you. How can I be jealous when you belong to me? I wanted to fight back, to come up with some smart remark. My words died on my lips when Alpha Maddox's hand gripped my face. His thumb ran over my lips, his eyes looking down on me as if I were the only person in the room. The passion and heat burning in his eyes had me clenching my legs together, fighting the arousal that burned when he was near. As soon as he had touched me, he backed away. I have some work to take care of today. Alpha Maddox smirked, clearly seeing how effective his words had been. Be good, Lola. Does this work have anything to do with Tyler? My throat ran dry as I spoke his name. While some part of me wanted to feel sympathy for Tyler, he had gotten himself into this situation. Alpha Maddox wasn't known for his mercy, Tyler would suffer before giving information. I was much too accepting of that fact. It does. Alpha Maddox's voice hardened, any lingering emotion wiped from his face. Once Alpha Maddox walked away, I headed into the locker rooms. Deciding I would just shower tonight, I slipped on some fresh clothes. I walked out of the locker room, my eyes scanning for Mason and Brianna. I sent them outside. Luna Freya's voice came from behind, they'll be out there waiting for you. Thanks. I breathed, my stomach twisting as I remember what she had asked of me. I had been so caught up in my fight with Alpha Bran, that I hadn't talked to Alpha Maddox about Brittany. All is forgiven. Luna Freya waved her hand, as though she could read my mind. I understand these last couple days have been eventful. I am sorry about that. I frowned, I haven't forgotten what you asked. I was able to contact my daughter. Luna Freya pursed her lips, her eyes locked on the lingering people in the building. Come with me. I followed Luna Freya into the empty locker room. Her eyes darted around suspiciously, making sure everyone had first cleared out. Once she was certain we were alone, she opened her mouth to speak. She gave me what information she could. Luna Freya pursed her lips, her hands intertwined tightly. They're keeping her under tight lock and key, since Tyler was captured and all. I understand. I frowned, he's not going to give in easy. Alpha Maddox isn't known for being merciful. I know exactly what Alpha Maddox is known for. Luna Freya's eyes went dark for a moment before returning to their usual light color. I hope with your help, he will not bring harm to my daughter. I promised to do what I could. I nodded, what was she able to tell you? Luna Freya took a deep breath, they won't tell her much. Her and Tyler had sought the vampires out but found themselves farther up the chain than they realized. They had found the Vampire King. Vampire King, the words were weak as they left my lips. Luna Freya shot me a sympathetic look, clearly mistaking my discomfort for fear. It wasn't fear I was feeling, but a sick sense of acceptance. The pieces I had been holding apart clicked together, and I was sure the sound could be heard in the locker room. Tyler and Brittany had gone searching for vampires but found much more than they bargained for. They found the Vampire King himself, my father. Chapter 61. I promised Luna Freya I would speak to Alpha Maddox about Brittany before the day ended. It was just another thing on my already full plate. I couldn't ignore the look of concern in Luna Freya's eyes, nor the fear she felt for her own daughter. I fully believed Luna Freya had faith in her daughter, but I remained rightfully suspicious. The last time I had met Brittany, she knew about the vampires they worked with. While she could have found out later on, my suspicion remained intact. I met up with Mason and Brianna outside of the training building. The moment I stepped outside, their eyes were locked on me. Concern and curiosity filled their gazes, and I knew what they would ask before their lips parted. "What did Luna Freya want with you?" Mason was the first to ask, his light-colored eyes filled with innocent curiosity. My gaze flickered to Brianna, her eyes holding the same emotion. The two of them looked much like myself. Hair messy and faces red from training, but wearing clean clothes. Brianna looked a little more worried than usual, but it seemed the entire pack was on edge. There hadn't been another MDR since Canyon, and I hoped he would be the last. Alpha Bran, Alpha Zeke, and Luna Freya each brought a handful of men with them. Their men added to our own patrol, increasing security around our small town. I doubted the vampires would strike with the added security, but it was best to always stay on guard. They had slipped through our defenses before, certainly they could again. I debated telling Mason and Brianna the truth. I had already trusted the two of them with so much and felt guilty keeping this bit of information from them. I decided to tell them about Luna Freya and her daughter, desperate for another opinion on the matter. "I'll tell you at your house." My eyes were set on Brianna. She shifted to her other foot, confusion filling her eyes. "I need to see that book your mom showed me." "All right." Brianna nodded. "She won't be home for another half hour. She's already curious about your sudden interest in vampires, asking a second time will make her suspicious." "That works for me." I nodded. I'm not sure Alpha Maddox wants everything out in the open right now. Alpha Maddox had been honest with everyone in the pack. They knew the AK had something to do with vampires, but hadn't a clue of the severity of the situation. I could tell Alpha Maddox hated keeping everyone in the dark, but he had to prevent panic from rising. Everyone was already on edge, but panic would lead to chaos. The three of us headed to Brianna's house. Her parents were teaching extra classes at the local college, but Brianna was used to living in a near-empty house. Her mom and dad both held a strong love for history. Their interests weren't designated to a specific species. Vampire, werewolf, human, they were interested in all. "It's on her special bookshelf." "Give me a minute." Brianna huffed with an exasperated eye roll. "Special bookshelf." Mason snorted, plopping down on the antique-looking couch. "Who has a special bookshelf?" "My parents do." Brianna grimaced, the large book in her hands. "It's where they keep all of their important texts and artifacts. They don't like me touching it, so this stays between us three." "How priceless can a book be?" Mason raised his eyebrow at Brianna, but she merely shook her head. "My parents have enough books and artifacts to fill a small museum." Brianna chuckled dryly as she sat beside me on the couch. I ignored the two of them as they began full-scale bickering. My fingers ran against the jagged pages, faded and stained with age. The book itself smelled old and musty, looking as though it would crumble to dust at any moment. The repairs Brianna's parents had made to the book were all that kept it from falling apart. A grimace formed on my face as I reread the information. "Did you expect it to change?" Maya chuckled humorlessly. "It says the same thing as before. I'm part of the Kuritis bloodline, we know that much." I frowned, discomfort filling me as the realization hit. "Which is why the shadows answer to you." Maya grimaced, recoiling at the idea. Did you find what you're looking for? Brianna frowned, her full lips puckered as though she wanted to say more. Something troubling flashed in her eyes, gone before I could look any further. Not really. I sighed, closing the book gently. Only reaffirming what I already know. What are you looking for, Lola? Brianna grimaced. Did something happen? If only you knew, I wanted to say. While I wasn't sure I wanted to mention my trip to visit the Vampire King, I needed to give her something. Instead of mentioning my visit, I told them about my fight with Alpha Bran. From the shock on their faces, neither of them had noticed anything strange that night. Only Alpha Maddox had seen the gathering shadows, had felt the cold chill rush against his skin. Part of me wondered if my grandma had seen the same, that would explain the sour expression on her face. Grandma wasn't one to miss things, she had the uncanny ability to see through people. I wouldn't be surprised if she saw exactly what happened that night. So, you can control shadows? Mason gaped, his eyes wide with a renewed sense of curiosity. Like some kind of superpower. Not everything is about superheroes. Brianna rolled her eyes. Well, excuse me for trying to lighten the mood. Mason narrowed his eyes at Brianna, who in turn scoffed. I wish it was like a superpower. I chuckled lowly, it feels a lot darker than that. I wonder if you can also get into people's minds like that one vampire did to you. Brianna hesitated, not wanting to speak Tristan's name. If only she knew the mere mention of Tristan sent a shard of longing piercing within me, one I ferociously fought against. She's part of the Curitis bloodline, but she's not a pure-blooded vampire. Mason pointed out, earning a surprised look from Brianna and I. I hadn't thought of that. Brianna frowned, so I guess you can't get into people's minds. I can live without that. I chuckled dryly as I remembered what it felt like to have my mind invaded. I don't think anyone should have that kind of power. I told the two of them what I heard that night, and how the shadows had fed from the blood leaving my ankle. Today, the cut on my ankle was nothing more than a pink line, but the searing pain that rushed through me would linger in my mind forever. The pain I had felt as the shadows fed from my blood was horrifying, so cold it almost felt hot. You have to pay for their services. Brianna shifted uncomfortably. That sounds kind of dangerous. It does, doesn't it? My face mirrored her own. Slowly, Mason's curious gaze faltered and turned into one of worry. I wouldn't use a gift like that. Brianna shook her head, her short hair bouncing from the movement. It doesn't sound like a gift at all. A gift you have to pay for in blood. Mason added in, a frown forming on his boyish face. The bigger the request, the higher the price. I recited the words my father had spoken last night. Like more blood. Mason frowned. What do shadows need blood for? I'm thinking the price isn't just about blood. Brianna frowned. To me, a high price would be someone's life. I wouldn't be surprised if they asked for that. I murmured, I don't plan on using that gift again. I silently promised myself to keep far from the shadows. The power to control them felt dark and alluring, a power I could see myself yielding completely to. The power was tempting, a soft caress against my cheek. I could see myself using this power, giving into it completely. It was a tempting idea, to use the shadows against my own father. What price would they command if I asked for his DTH? For the deaths of the vampires against us? The ideas that crossed my thoughts sent an icy chill down my spine. Is that why you wanted to see the book again? Brianna frowned, another hidden flash ghosting past her almond-shaped eyes. I wanted to see if anything else fit, now that I know more. I sighed, I really want to know about this stupid mark on my skin. Brianna hesitated, clearly debating on whether she should say something or not. Her eyes were pained, her lips pressed tightly together. My mom has a secret stash of books, ones she won't let me see. Brianna spoke the words quietly, as though her mom were hiding in the walls listening to our conversation. I was thinking about finding them to help you, of course. They might have more information about vampires. I couldn't help but linger on Brianna's words. She had clearly thought of these books long before I mentioned my heritage, but decided not to speak on it. I couldn't shake the feeling she had her own reason for wanting those books. Would you be able to find them? I frowned, my eyes sparkling with interest. I already know where they are. Brianna's eyes flickered to the hallway in her house. Locked in a safe, that's how important they are. She'd kill me if she ever found out I touched them. Can you get into the safe? I pressed, can I see them now? Not now. Brianna shook her head, her eyes glancing to the large clock on the wall. Mom will be home in 10 minutes. We can get them tomorrow after training, her and Dad have tons of lectures tomorrow. Tomorrow. My stomach twisted into knots at the thought of learning more. I can't promise they'll have anything about vampires. Brianna frowned, but it's the only place I know to look. It's a start. I nodded, your mom keeps those books hidden for a reason, let's hope it helps. Brianna had tucked away the old book before her mom came home. The three of us stayed on the couch, our faces lighting up with innocence as her mom walked through the door. Where's Dad? Brianna quipped calmly, tucking a strand of her light-colored hair behind her ear. A student needed his help with their presentation, he'll be home in an hour or so. Brianna's mom shot the three of us a smile, one that said she was glad it wasn't her staying behind at work. Brianna's mom offered to cook the three of us dinner, to which we wholeheartedly refused. Brianna's mom couldn't cook to save her life, and had given up many years ago. The three of us made sandwiches, eating them in silence. While I wanted to continue talking about my complicated lineage, I couldn't do so in front of her mom. My fingers were practically twitching at the thought of getting my hands on those books. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.